You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
Good afternoon. It is Friday, September 13th. I am Assistant News Director Justin Mitchell, and this is The Outcue. This week, 21 News aired its fourth 101 West special. That's a special, of course, if you're not familiar, where we take a topic that requires some really deep dive reporting and then we scour the country or the planet to find the best experts to take a look into an issue that has a direct impact on your day-to-day life. This time around, we were actually getting ready to prepare for an idea for a 101 West special, and moments before we went into a meeting to discuss what that was going to entail, we started hearing scanner traffic about an explosion at the Realty building in downtown Youngstown. That has gone on to dominate news coverage locally all summer long with various angles to cover at the local level. But it leaves also a question as to how could something like this happen, and is there any regulation that could stop incidents like this? And also, how often does this happen? This is certainly not the first time we've heard of a natural gas related explosion. So with me today to discuss the topic of this week's 101 West is Madison Tromler. We're calling this one the danger beneath us. So what did we find out that was surprising about natural gas pipelines and what you might not realize about them? A lot, right?
Yes. So, well, going into it, I think I just didn't realize that there are all millions of miles of these underground natural gas lines that we don't think about, we don't see them, and we know that they're there. We know that natural gas powers a lot of homes and businesses, but I think just finding out that they're all over, and they started being constructed in the previous century, even going back to the 1800s. So these can be pipelines that are hundreds of years old, and it's hard to keep track of these. So over time, you get to a point where you don't know what's where. You don't know what you have in the ground, and this can lead to a series of potential failures if there's mistakes in the way something's constructed. In this case in Youngstown, we're hearing about the preliminary cause could have been from excavators, third-party workers, which is now a key concern that is being investigated. But I think the most interesting thing is just how over time, something so small that can maybe be happening underground, maybe some other line is hitting a gas line, or maybe someone disrupted a gas line a little bit underground, but over time it can lead to a gas leak and then potentially some sort of catastrophic, deadly explosion. And it's not to scare anyone, but it's just something to be aware of, this danger beneath us with all these lines running underground.
How often are there explosions? Because that was one of the many facts in working on this that surprised me. You hear about them sometimes, but they're more common than we realize, aren't they?
They're not rare. And in terms of an exact number, it was, and I know we discussed this, it was pretty interesting during my research, is that it's not completely clear the exact number, but what we do know is that only some of them, depending on how much damage caused and if anyone died, only some of them do get reported on the only database that really has all of that information as to how many. So it can be hundreds, up to 300 a year can happen. Obviously, some can be a lot worse than others. We know this year there have been at least 3 to 4 that the National Transportation Safety Board is investigating, and that's more than they typically do investigate every year. I believe usually they investigate 1 to 3. So this year they are a little bit ahead of how many they usually investigate. So there can be hundreds per year, but they're not always going to make the news. They're not always super serious.
And the NTSB does not investigate anywhere near all of them. They pick and choose for various reasons. For instance, you mentioned the third-party workers. They specifically said that one of the reasons they're investigating this one in Youngstown is because they have an interest in determining what role third-party workers play. And when we say third-party workers, we're really just talking about anybody who's not the gas company, right?
Yes. So the third party, exactly, would be anyone who's not the gas operator. So this could be someone hired by the gas operator or someone hired by another entity. We know that the city of Youngstown contracted with Greenheart, and Greenheart then engaged with these workers to do this job. So that would be considered obviously a third party.
Now, I want to go back a little bit to when you talked about all these millions of miles, because I think one of the experts that you spoke to compared it to how many miles of highway miles there are, and there's way more natural gas pipeline than there are highway miles in the United States, to put that in some perspective. And that's only the lines we know about, right? They've only really been tracking these since, what was the year, 1964, if I remember correctly?
I forgot the exact year.
But it was the 60s.
Yes, yeah, right.
So prior to that, you've got about 100 years worth of gas lines that we don't necessarily even have a vague idea where they are.
Right, and you mentioned the 1960s, and I believe it's not late 1960s, because 1970.
68.
Okay, somewhere between 1968 and 1970-ish is when federal pipeline regulation went into effect. So the pipelines are older than the laws and the regulation. So that means that in terms of the uniform construction of pipelines and keeping track of them, it goes way further back than when they started doing that. And a big concern in Ohio, because one of the experts I spoke with, I believe this is the only expert who is actually local, but is from Ohio, and we have, many people are familiar with Call Before You Dig, 811. So we have the Ohio 811, which is branched under an organization in Ohio, the Ohio Utilities Safety Commission, and it just so happens to be based in North Jackson, here locally by us in Ohio, which I thought was interesting because I didn't realize Ohio 811, Call Before You Dig, was in our
our
viewing
North
area.
Jackson.
Yeah. So he brought up a really interesting point, that Ohio has never had uniform construction standards for the installation of pipelines. So, and he said it himself, you don't know what's down there. And he said if there were just some, from this day forward, if we had specific laws as to what material, how exactly you should construct the distribution, the service lines that we're talking about, the lines that connect to the main line that go into our buildings and homes and get us our natural gas. He says if there were uniform standards, we wouldn't see the catastrophic explosions that we have today, because it would be a bit more uniform. So he believes that would stop it.
So we essentially have a situation right now where not only do we not know where they all are, but we also don't know how they're all made. So they could be using different materials, they could be connected different ways. And as the earth shifts or there's construction, I think Richard Kuperwitz was one of the experts that you spoke to, who, I think it was Richard Kuperwitz in this special, who said every accident is essentially human error. But it's not as simple as, for instance, it seems like in the Realty building, somebody cut a line that was supposed to be dead, or they were told was dead, and it turned out that it had gas in it. Sometimes it's more like there's a project that moves earth, and maybe it hits, I think you alluded to this, it hits a water line, but the water line's near a gas line that you didn't know was there, and that weakened that gas line, and then as the project settles in, you might 20 years down the road have a weakened gas line that's been leaking slowly, pressurizing slowly, and no one knows it's there.
Right. And the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board, is working to determine the cause. But as we learned, also another expert, a former NTSB director, Robert Hall, explained that there's different categories of causes. There's going to be here's the cause that the NTSB is going to find. But as you mentioned, Kuperwitz said that often it is a series of failures. He says in his 25 plus years of investigating natural gas explosions, he's never seen a one-off incident where third-party worker accidentally cut the line and that was it. He said there are often a series of failures that get linked from over time that could have potentially caused this. And we don't want to speculate exactly what that could have been, but well, first off, what was the lack of communication that led to this worker believing that this line was dead? And then before that, why did this line have pressurized gas in it when someone believed that it was dead? And then what was the process in which they stopped the line? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the word.
Plugged?
Begins with an A.
Plugged? Oh, A?
The stopped the line from being in service.
Abandoned
the line. Did they follow that process to abandon the line when they should have? Was it actually abandoned? Or did the gas company know that line was there?
So all of that, I think, gets to the overall discovery here, which is that anything that's dangerous and is subject to human error, the great regulator here is regulation. Now, it would not be accurate to just say this is an industry with no regulation. There's, books worth of regulation. Why isn't that stopping these accidents from happening?
Yeah, and to be clear, the natural gas companies, they do what many experts out there believe is a fine job at doing what they can to track these. They have maps and different systems that they do. They do what they can, obviously to do their job, and they don't want to see their infrastructure or any, incidents happen like that. So it's not to say that these gas companies don't have their own systems in place.
Sure.
And do, probably a lot of, as we know, a lot of self-regulation as well. But in terms of how this can happen, and even the experts I spoke with say they may have been doing everything right in this situation, and it could still happen. So that right there tells us there are some loopholes in the regulation, which we go super in depth with in our full report. But in this case, what we found in I was reading the Ohio Revised Code, and there's some specific situations in which where you don't have to call before you dig. So in Ohio, if you're doing any excavation, any work underground, that's when you would call 811 to ensure that you're not cutting into a natural gas line or doing anything that could cause a gas leak or an explosion. But in the Ohio Revised Code, there's some situations where you don't have to call. One being if the explosion, or I'm sorry, if the building is in an area that could, and we actually didn't get into this one in the report, but it's the first one I thought of. If the building is where it could affect vehicle or pedestrian traffic, for example, it says you wouldn't have to get those utility lines marked. And then we also found that excavators and third-party workers aren't required to have a license in Ohio. So, and then the other loophole we were getting into was there's even certain loopholes with holidays in which you don't have to call 811. And then we found that even if they did call 811, which they weren't required to do, they wouldn't have even gotten the line marked because they were already under the impression that there was no gas in it. And then one other thing is, by definition, these people that were doing this work were not considered excavators anyways, because they were doing scrap removal work in the Realty building basement area. So there's all these sort of, but wait, never mind, they still wouldn't have been required to call.
That's one of the ones that I think is most interesting, because I don't know that a lot of people realize, is ownership of the line. So if we're talking about a line, sometimes it's a matter of a foot one way or the other. This is underground, so this is not an exact science, and yet without it being exact, it leaves a lot to be determined, because there are lines that are the responsibility of the gas company. And the gas company, if they're working on a line, they have people who are highly qualified, highly trained, they know what they're doing, they carry certain licensures, they know how to work on a gas line. But if that same line is under your building, whether that be your home or even a commercial building like the Realty building that had a Chase Bank and had people's apartments, that's no longer the responsibility of the gas company. That's the responsibility of the owner. And so there's no requirement that anybody working on the line that falls beneath those buildings have any idea how to work on a gas line. They can basically do the best that they can. Now, obviously, there's, short of something criminal, there's nobody that's trying to cause an explosion, because it's a loss of life, it's a loss of money, it's a loss of, there's nothing productive about it. But if you're someone who's trying to embark on a project and is, kind of fancies yourself handy, there's nothing that says you can't mess with a gas line in the basement of a commercial building or under a commercial street. If it's under a sidewalk, it might be the city's responsibility. That gets murky. But it's a foot one way or the other that makes that determination.
Right. And that's something that they're still trying to determine right now, is exactly the jurisdiction of that line. And they're trying to figure out how this happened and whose line this exactly was. So, and I think a lot of it too is the fact that, let's just say there were there weren't loopholes in place, and it was a situation where the city would have had to jump through some hoops, and then Greenheart would have had to jump through some hoops before doing this. Guess what? It would have taken a lot longer.
Sure.
And it would have been more expensive. So I do think that that's part of this here, is that economically these loopholes allow for a city or certain building owners. There's also loopholes for, is the owner of the building the same as the person contracting the work? Interestingly enough, so I think there's an economic component to it as well that exists in a lot of transportation modes, as we've
Right. So it's a balancing of a way to do it efficiently, but it does get harder to track. We just did a story this week about what we found out about who the people in that basement were. They were not Greenheart workers. They were hired by Greenheart. So they're even further removed from any chain of expertise.
Right.
So in keeping with what this podcast is about, I'd like you to go into a little bit about the people you spoke to and how you found them and how we decided on the experts we were going to speak to. Because as always with these things, until something happens, we have no expertise that we don't have to go out and get to relay this information. So who did we talk to? What are their bios? How did we find them?
The first expert I found was Richard Cooperwitz, and he's a super expert and definitely very insightful. He's been doing this for his whole entire career, decades, and he is a regulatory advisor, and he testifies before regulators talk. He looks into natural gas and pipeline investigations when these incidents happen. He said he's seen deadly explosions of all kinds all across the country. And not to take away from, obviously, this deadly, horrific incident in Youngstown, but the way he describes it is, he's seen whole city blocks disappear and bodies and just horrific incidents. So he's very passionate about safety and believing that more can be done. So I found him. Well, actually, I found him because I did a story, and at first I was like, his name's familiar. I definitely know him. But a couple years ago, or was this last year? I don't remember.
This was a couple years ago.
Okay, we did a story because so I'm just going to quickly, not to get off topic, there was a pipeline running under a proposed area in Campfield where they were going to build a new school, and it was an ethane pipeline, and that was drawing some controversy over building the school there. It ended up being voted down in the levy, I remember, because people were concerned. Anyways, we interviewed him because he's a pipeline expert, not just natural gas, but other hazardous materials as well. So I ended up finding him just when I was just reading reports, older NTSB investigations and whatnot, and I reached out to him and I was like, oh yeah, I've interviewed him before on another pipeline story. So, and he was great and he was very insightful. He now works for a company as a regulatory advisor and continues to do pipeline investigations and that sort of thing. So
what's the company he works for now?
It's Accufax.
Okay.
Accufax, yeah. So so there's him, and then I interviewed, and then we also got in touch with the National Transportation Safety Board, and we ended up going to Washington, D.C. and setting up an interview with Tom Chapman, and he's a board member. And he was one of the first people here in Youngstown on the ground at the Realty building after the explosion happened. NTSB heard about the explosion through the news. They heard about what was going on, and they initially heard about that there could have been some third-party involvement, and this was something that they have been wanting to look into, and they were like, okay, we really need to look into this. He came here and started looking all over the property. And so he was the person that we interviewed in DC to talk about the investigative process and what we can expect and the big questions that they're asking, which is why was there gas in that line, and the concern about the third-party workers. So they're hoping to come up with some recommendations that could potentially lead to, they hope, some more regulation surrounding the safety of these natural gas lines and the third-party workers. So he was the other interview. And then I decided to reach out to Ohio 811's president and executive director, Roger Lipscomb, because he's worked, I thought that he would be a great expert because he's worked on every side of natural gas pipelines. Right. He's worked for contractors, he's done line location, and now he's on the total other side where he now represents the organization that alerts gas companies when someone calls 811. So there's a partnership essentially between these Ohio gas operators, gas companies, and Ohio 811. But so initially I think we were like, do we want to talk with Ohio 811? What exactly are they going to offer? They're the call before you dig people, and they do have something to push. They want people to call 811. They get funded by people calling 811. So, but in talking with him, he was a passionate guy who really knows a lot about this topic, and he was very candid about the construction regulations that don't exist, or the construction standards that don't exist in Ohio, and he was candid about the danger beneath us and saying, we don't know what's underground.
And that's incredibly important that we find people like that too, because we've done this with our other 101 Wests also. It's not, if we only had regulatory people, you could easily make the case that, all right, yeah, you're finding people whose bread is buttered by more regulation. Of course, they think there should be more regulation. We're finding people who are very, very much not opposed in any way to the natural gas industry. These are not anti-gas people. They're just people who want things done safely, whether it be from a regulatory standpoint or from an industry standpoint, right?
Right, and people who sometimes may not even believe more regulation is the answer. Right. There are very solid points as to why sometimes more regulation might not necessarily help. Now, awareness, he thinks the public need, and obviously, and I said, awareness, if it's not a regulation, how can the public be more aware? But they do believe that there needs to be more education for people to understand that these pipelines are beneath us, because it's something that we forget about all the time. And, when this happened, I was like, we hear about gas leaks, but I was like, oh my gosh, I've never been around a natural gas explosion. But when you look back, I was even talking with Steve, our morning anchor, and he said in stations he's worked at in the past, like he heard about house explosions in every market he worked at. So they do happen. It can be a new home. It can be so many different situations.
Often when they happen, because I've covered them many times too, but another thing is that often what happens is that somebody might go and cut copper wiring or copper pipes in the basement. Any number of these things, though, nobody down there doing that, which is obviously a petty crime.
Right.
They don't realize that they could be putting their lives in danger and the lives of others. They think that it's a petty crime.
Right. So yeah, to answer your question, he was someone who may not be necessarily pushing for some new federal mandates, or he does believe that Ohio should have construction standards in place. That was his big thing. But he was really someone who was explaining why the public needs to be more aware and what Ohio could do, some common sense regulation that would help stop this from happening. So he was definitely insightful, and I sat down with him for probably almost 2 hours, and we just I asked him every possible thing I could think of, and he was very insightful. And then Jim Hall, not to be confused with Robert Hall, they both have the same last name. So Robert Hall was, did I even get to him yet?
No.
Oh, okay. Anyways, so Jim Hall, he's a former NTSB chair. So he's the Jen Homendy back from 1997 to like 2001 or something like that. And he was really candid. I saw him in some previous news reports about some other, I believe he talked about the Keystone pipeline and different things in the past and different pipeline concerns. So he ended up being someone who was also very insightful and just talked about how he said exemptions, which is what we were talking about, the loophole, the exemptions in some of Ohio's laws, he says is a license to kill. When you have these exemptions, that's how unnecessary death can occur.
Sure.
So he was really, I think, cleared up for me that, yes, these exemptions do exist across the country and it is an issue and the states, need to do better. And he also touched on the lobbying issue that we've talked about in the past and the fact that, funding sometimes does get in the way of these private companies wanting to have more regulation, wanting to, have maybe stricter licensing standards or more technology to locate lines. These are just examples, but
there's an argument that the industry could make, a legitimate argument that, listen, loss of life, loss of property, having to clean up, having to shut down these sites, this, on a practical sense, hurts the company. So why would they want that? They're going to do the best that they can, whether you regulate it or not, because it hurts them. It's not in their interest to do this sloppy.
Right. Yeah. And I think about that too, because they, in a sense, are trusted with that responsibility, and they have a good track record. I mean, the pipelines work, I mean, for the most part, but then you have these incidents that aren't rare, as the experts say, and they do happen, and it's just one of those things where sometimes it's hard to find what the answer is. But it sounds like these experts say there are these common sense regulations that could be imposed that could stop it. But yes, the gas companies day to day, of course, as we know, do what they can to operate successfully.
One of them referred to a ghost of the federal government leaving it to the states to regulate, which is where you get this sort of Swiss cheese where everybody does it a little bit differently. Nobody's regulations are uniform.
It's kind of like pointing fingers. Like the federal government's going to say, well, and this is something Jim Hall brought up, is, when people look to the federal government, it's kind of them not taking accountability as a state to say, hey, because with natural gas pipelines, especially, every state has a totally different geography and landscape and totally different, they all need different rules for pipelines, just like with railroads. Not all states are the same in the way that they have their topography, the way that their land is set up, and the way that how, their population, and, like New York City obviously has a totally different vibe going on than Columbiana.
Right. There's
going to be way different needs and ways that they need to be put in the ground, these pipelines. So essentially, the states have that accountability to take it as further as they want. And the states do impose different standards, but past the federal requirements, but the federal regulations just require a minimum. So, and it's difficult to get the PISMA, the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. It takes a really long time, and it's really, really hard to get them to get new regulation on the books. They're actually the only federal agency that has to go through the Office of Budget and Management, I was told. The only one.
Do we know why that is?
I do not know. But this was Cooperwitz that told me that, and I asked him why, and he said, I don't know, but that's the way it is. And I would imagine, because when you think about that office of the pipeline, that's not just natural gas pipelines. That's
right.
We were dealing with FSMA when we had questions about railroads and the hazardous materials that, so I mean, our country transports stuff of all kinds all the time everywhere.
Right.
So
well, and when we hear hazardous materials, you stop and think, there are a lot of hazardous materials that have a purpose. I know when I hear hazardous materials, I think of people in a hazmat suit. I think of like nuclear waste. Yeah, those are hazardous materials. But, so is the gas you put in your car.
Right. And these are things we need.
Right.
So, yeah. So, but anyways, I forget exactly what I was saying. But yeah, PISMA, it takes them a long time to get new regulation on the books. And then if it's some sweeping new changes, that will have to go through Congress. Some changes these agencies can make, but my understanding of it is also PISMA's not a huge agency, and historically there has been some people definitely think that PISMA does a great job, similar to the NTSB, but
Sure.
there has been some criticism over maybe some lack of funding and maybe not as many resources given to PISMA. And I believe right now, and I don't have the answer as to why, but I did ask the White House, I believe right now they're still not ahead of PISMA.
That's right. Never even been one nominated, correct? I mean, I believe under the Biden administration, there's not been a nominee.
Not a nominee, right, exactly. And I think there's an acting person who's doing that. So we thought that was interesting, and not that it plays a direct role into like this situation, but it makes you wonder why this agency that we've been in touch with a lot the past year after the derailment and now the explosion, they don't have. We'll have to see if that changes under a new presidency, but. So essentially, to answer that, I know I just talked for like 10 minutes, but to answer that, yeah, there's statewide and there's federal, and it's difficult to get it passed, to get new regulation on either. And it would be up to the state of Ohio to really come up with some new standards, which right now they actually are coming up with some changes for how to abandon a line, because there's not standards in Ohio for that. That's lacking. That's something that Ohio 811 mentioned to me, and that's something that Ohio did just announce that they're working on. So there's some movement there, but that's something that the states have to explore more options of how to be safer.
And it moves slowly. So now, the special aired last night. If you missed it, you can still watch it. Where can people find it?
Yes, you can watch it on our 21 WFMJ news app. You can watch it on YouTube and anywhere else.
And on our website, if you want to just go to it by a desktop.
Yep, WFMJ.com. Make sure you download the 21 News app, because we have all the stuff there, and we post it in the entirety on YouTube, correct?
It will be there in its entirety, yes. Well, that does it for this week's edition of the Outcue. Next week we'll be back again with something else and completely different. But in the meantime, if you want to reach us, you can always call us at 330-744-8821. You can email us at news@wfmj.com. And if there's ever anything that's particularly rubbing you the wrong way that you think needs a little bit of work, remember that we're one of the only outlets that really will put in the weeks. And how long did we work on this one for?
All
this
summer
was a quick
long.
one.
All summer, yeah, it was. It was the longest one too. But yes, it was the longest piece and also the quickest. We started the end of May or early June, I think.
Yeah, we pretty much
All
switched to
summer.
this shortly after the incident happened on May 28th. So the point being that we will take the time to dig into anything that you think we need to dig into, so you can reach us also at Watchdog at WFMJ.com. Until next week, this has been the Outcue.